History as it happens, March 30th, 2023. Waco.
Who has the ultimate responsibility for the plan that went tragically wrong?
Those children are dead because David Koresh had them killed. There's no question about that. He had those fires started.
Flames may be out, but a firestorm of controversy rages on.
There's nothing to hide here. This was probably the most well-covered operation of its kind in the history of the country.
Fanatical, scripture-quoting religious leader who moved to Waco to await the end of the world.
These people killed 4 federal officials in the line of duty.
A massive car bomb exploded outside of a large federal building in downtown Oklahoma City, shattering that building, killing children, killing federal employees.
It was an act of cowardice, and it was evil. The United States will not tolerate it.
Donald Trump held his first rally of the 2024 campaign at a special place in far-right mythology, amid the 30th anniversary of the siege of the Branch Davidian compound by federal authorities. Was it a mere coincidence or a deliberate move to stoke anti-government vibes among militias, sovereign citizens, and J6ers, whose decades-old ideas are bleeding into the mainstream of American life? That's next as we report history as it happens. Podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
Our opponents have done everything they can to crush our spirit and to break our will, but they've failed. They've only made us stronger. And 2024 is the final battle. That's going to be the big one. If you put me back in the White House, their reign will be over, and America will be a free nation once again.
For the far right, those moments were evidence that the federal government was coming to get you.
The 51-day standoff from February 28th to April 19th, 1993, at the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas, doesn't inhabit a spot on my mental calendar of important historical anniversaries. In fact, I didn't realize until just a couple days ago that we're in the midst of the 30th anniversary. I was reminded because a former president chose Waco to hold his first campaign rally, a rally that began with the J6 prison choir singing a mashup of the Star-Spangled Banner and Pledge of Allegiance, as Donald Trump stood ramrod straight on a stage holding his arm in salute. The J6 Prison Choir. I didn't even know it existed. It's made up of people doing time for attacking the Capitol on Trump's behalf on January 6, 2021. You know, at the top of the podcast, I said anti-government fanaticism is bleeding into the political mainstream. I did not mean lots of Republican voters are militia members or are a step away from taking up arms against the government. And we should also recall how some top Republican lawmakers condemned Trump after January 6th, even if they didn't vote to convict him after his second impeachment.
January 6th was a disgrace. American citizens attacked their own government. They used terrorism to try to stop a specific piece of domestic business they did not like. Fellow Americans beat and bloodied our own police. They stormed the Senate floor. They tried to hunt down the Speaker of the House. They built a gallows and chanted about murdering the Vice President. They did this because they'd been fed wild falsehoods by the most powerful man on earth. Because he was angry he'd lost an election.
But Donald Trump is the favorite, as of today anyway, to win the GOP nomination next year. If the polls are accurate, he seems to have paid no real political price, at least among right-of-center voters, for egging on a mob to attack Congress, for trying to overturn the election, for being the first U.S. president not to accept the peaceful transfer of power, for glorifying the J6 prison choir. You know, I listened to his entire speech at the rally. It ran well over an hour. It was his typical rambling monologue, peppered with apocalyptic warnings about internal enemies.
Together we are taking on some of the most menacing forces and vicious opponents our people have ever seen, some of them from within. But no matter how hateful and corrupt the communists and criminals we're fighting against may be, You must never forget, this nation does not belong to them. Let there be no doubt the injustices being done, not only to me, but to dozens across our country will not stand, and we're not going to stand for it. When this election is over, I will be the President of the United States. We've been the ones in this fight standing up to the globalists and standing up to the Marxists and communists. That's what they are. Either we surrender to the demonic forces abolishing and demolishing and happily doing so our country, or we defeat them in a landslide on November 5th, 2024.
Trump and his campaign denied they chose Waco because of its significance in the far-right lore. The place where Branch Davidians violently clashed with federal law enforcement 30 years ago. Timothy McVeigh, an Army veteran of the First Persian Gulf War, visited during the siege that ended April 19, 1993. And what happened exactly 2 years later, April 19, 1995?
It's believed to be a 1,200-pound car bomb ripped through the 9-story federal building shortly after 9 o'clock this morning. More than 500 people were...
The bombing in Oklahoma City was an attack on innocent children and defenseless citizens. It was an act of cowardice, and it was evil. The United States will not tolerate it, and I will not allow the people of this country to be intimidated by evil cowards.
As I intend to tell our guest today, I've given right-wing militias, white supremacist groups, the sovereign citizens, a group I've never even heard of until recently, scant attention over the years, but I may have been wrong to ignore their significance or growing visibility. But Americans elected a president in 2016 who would ultimately embrace political violence at the end of his term. And that was in character, as we recall Trump's reluctance to unequivocally condemn, say, white supremacists after the violent Unite the Right rally in 2017.
But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides. You had people in that group, excuse me, I saw the same pictures as you did. You had people in that group that were there to protest the taking down of, to them, a very, very important statue and the renaming of a park from Robert E. Lee to another name.
What individuals like Timothy McVeigh and all these groups share in common, and this goes for left-wing extremists too, is an unshakable belief that the U.S. government is the enemy, and you have a right to violently make your point. That seems to be the point of Trump's choice of Waco for his rally, although again, he and his supporters say that is not why they chose that location. As Vanderbilt University historian Nicole Hemmer writes in an op-ed at CNN.com, the Waco siege occurred in the midst of a period of growing far-right anti-government activism in the United States. The modern movement, marked by military-style training, weapons stockpiles, and political violence, emerged in the Mountain West and Pacific Northwest during the 1970s and grew as time went on. Groups such as the Posse Comitatus, Christian Identity, Sovereign Citizens, and Aryan Nations developed radical anti-government philosophies often rooted in white supremacy and armed rebellion. Nicole Hemmer is also the author of Messengers of the Right, Conservative Media and the Transformation of American Politics, and Partisans, the Conservative Revolutionaries Who Remade American Politics in the 1990s. Nikki Hemmer, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
You know, I did not plan on doing a Waco siege anniversary episode. Matter of fact, I had forgotten that the siege was taking place at this time on the calendar 30 years ago. What does Waco signify to these far-right, let's call them anti-government militia groups?
Waco sits among these groups as a touchstone and as an excuse for using armed resistance to the federal government, along with Ruby Ridge, which had happened the year before. There were these two sieges that were carried out by federal agents. At Ruby Ridge, some white separatists were killed. At Waco, more than 80 people were killed during the siege with an extremist religious sect. For the far right, those moments were evidence that the federal government was coming to get you. So Timothy McVeigh, goes to Waco during the siege, because this is a siege that lasts for 51 days. He goes to Waco during the siege to serve as witness to the events that were going on there. And 2 years later, he timed the bombing at Oklahoma City to coincide with the second anniversary of Waco. And ever since then, it has been part of patriot lore. It has been part of conspiracies. It has been an excuse for violence. It still looms quite large on the right.
Oklahoma City bombing April 19th, 1995. Terry Nichols, who is McVeigh's accomplice, he was a member or considered himself a sovereign citizen.
Yeah, so a sovereign citizen is one of those far-right groups that emerges in the American West in the 1970s. There's Christian Identity, which is a far-right Christian group. There's Posse Comitatus. There are all of these quasi-militia groups that are emerging in the West during the 1970s and that gained power in the 1980s and 1990s. And sovereign citizens are one of these. Sovereign citizens believe that there is no higher justice system than the individual, than themselves, that they are the final arbiters of what the Constitution means, and they need no recognition from the federal government to claim their rights of citizenship. You know, it can be things from like, the government can't tell me what to do with my property, and therefore I don't need the government to give me a driver's license or a license plate in order to operate my car. I don't need to pay the government taxes. And I don't need to respect the authority of whether it's local police and law enforcement or federal agents, which are often the kinds of government representatives that people in the West would encounter the most, the Bureau of Land Management and Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms.
Do they use the post office, I'm wondering? You trust in the government.
They drive on government roads, right?
Yeah.
And often graze on government lands if they are ranchers, but they have this ideology that arches over it all.
So as I mentioned, I wasn't planning on doing a podcast about militias or Waco until one of my colleagues here at the Washington Times, Sean Salai, wrote an article about the sovereign citizens. You were quoted in that article. I never really paid much attention to these militias. They all just seem like a bunch of crazies on the fringes. Although I don't think we should dismiss them as a bunch of nuts. I mean, they take what they believe very seriously. But just small groups of grown men infatuated with guns and dreams of trying to overthrow the government. They operated outside of politics. But I don't think we can say that anymore. Do you believe that these ideologies, if we can call them that, have bled into mainstream politics?
Oh, absolutely. And it's not an innovation of the last 5 years or so. There certainly were, particularly Republicans who represented Western states in the 1990s who had ties with militias. Helen Chenoweth, who was a representative from Idaho, had close ties with militias, held hearings about Ruby Ridge, which was in her district. So there were these ties between some members of Congress and militias in the 1990s when they were first emerging as these visible groups. But in recent years, it's not just a handful of members of Congress. During the years when Donald Trump was president, he threw his support to groups like the Proud Boys. It was during the Obama years that we saw the rise of new militia groups, new organizing, groups like the 3%ers and all different kinds of far-right organizations, some of which were militias, some of which were white supremacist groups. And over the last 6 years or so, in places like Charlottesville, but also in places like the U.S. Capitol during the siege on January 6th, we have seen these groups not only acting violently, but in the case of January 6th, acting in concert with the President of the United States. And so they can't be ignored because of that.
The Trump campaign said it did not choose Waco because of the Branch Davidian siege, and that was the group of religious extremists who were at the center of the siege 30 years ago. David Koresh, I believe, said he was Jesus Christ or something like that. But the Trump campaign said they chose Waco because it's centrally located between a bunch of Texas cities. But you believe he chose Waco to send a signal. What signal is that?
I don't think that excuse is plausible given the choice of Waco and given, it happened within this 51-day period marking the 30th anniversary of the siege. And at the rally in Waco, it starts off with a recording from what's called the J6 Choir with Donald Trump reciting the Pledge of Allegiance and people who were arrested for their involvement in the siege on the Capitol singing in the background behind him. There were images from the siege of the Capitol Capitol playing on a screen in the background. And the overarching theme of the rally was Donald Trump telling the people gathered there, "I am your retribution." And that idea of vengeance and avenging whatever perceived wrongs of the past, it's not even a dog whistle. It is a clarion call to these far-right groups that he's on their side and that he supports and encourages their actions.
The United States was founded after a revolution against what was viewed as an overweening or a government that violated the natural rights of the people, no longer consulted the consent of the governed. There's always been this strain of anti-government, let's call it an ideology, in American culture. We can go back to the Whiskey Rebellion, right? Against paying the excise tax on wheat, I think, or what was it? Whatever they used to make.
It was whiskey turned from corn.
Corn, thank you. As you can tell, I'm not in that line of work. These modern groups, they organize around what ideas of Christian identity, white supremacy? What are some of the other organizing factors?
Yeah, it really varies among the different groups. Some of them, as you rightly note, are around racial identity. Christian identity is a big part of this. Absolute rights to bear arms. So gun rights is often a big part of this. The anti-tax part is still a pretty big part of this, as well as anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, anti-government conspiracy theories, you name it, and you can probably find a group that is organized around a particular type of conspiracy or opposition to federal or state power.
So historically, these movements, or these groups, I should say, they emerged in the West, the Pacific Northwest, the Mountain West, during the 1970s. What was happening during the 70s that fed into the formation of these groups?
It's a great question. I mean, there was a lot going on and a number of different things that feed into this. So part of it is a kind of radical anti-tax movement that is taking root and that has a very mainstream counterpart, right? The tax revolts in a mainstream, let's go to the voting booth kind of way, is emerging in the West in the 1970s as well. Proposition 13 in California in 1978 is an anti-tax movement, but this is kind of the more radical edge of that. You also have fears of demographic change that are occurring as both the passage of the Civil Rights Act and the passage of immigration reform in 1965 are taking root. And you also have the Vietnam War coming to an end and veterans coming home, some of whom align with these ideologies, but also this flood of war material coming into the United States as well. That's only going to become more prominent in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So it's not just that people have this ideology, but now they have access to weapons of war that they can stockpile and begin to use against the government and other targets.
At the other end of the political spectrum, there were left-wing terrorist groups around this time as well, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, you have during this period groups like Weather Underground, Puerto Rican independence, separatist groups who attack Congress at one point. What ends up being the difference in the long run is their relationship to the political movement. The far-right groups are eventually going to find purchase within the right wing of the Republican Party in a way that Weather Underground sort of, well, first of all, they blow themselves up and then sort of get dismantled as a group. And there's a tendency more towards moderation, particularly as Democrats start losing elections in the 1970s. So there's a little bit of a difference. But yes, there has been a long tradition of anti-government violence. And, you know, we've talked about, and most sovereign citizen groups are on the far right and identified often with racist politics. But there are Black sovereign citizen groups as well who see this as a way of kind of liberating themselves from what they see as the tyranny of the federal government. There are a lot of diverse identities and ideologies within this group.
Are private militias even legal in the United States?
They are not. They are actually illegal in all 50 states. But the thing to understand is there are these groups that call themselves militias, who take the title of militias, who might wear uniforms, who do training, who might be arming themselves. But until they assert themselves as law enforcement, until they try to detain someone or try to take on the law enforcement powers of the state, they're not breaking the law, right? Freedom of assembly protects their ability to organize as groups. And it's only when they cross the line to act the way that state militia might that they cross the line to breaking the law.
So these groups grew in the 70s and the 80s, and then they seemed to go in decline or getting less attention maybe during the George W. Bush presidency. So what happened after that to bring them back into, I don't want to say prominence, but...
The election of Barack Obama saw a rapid escalation in the numbers of people who were joining militias. I mean, you also see this in gun and ammunition sales as soon as Barack Obama is elected. The financial crisis does not help matters. The sense that the world is falling apart around them definitely helps to feed some of this militia membership. But it really was the election of a Black president, the fears that he would be using all of the levers of government, right? All the conspiracy theories that emerge around Barack Obama really do help the growth of this movement. What's interesting is, we were certainly aware of the growth in this movement at the time. In fact, Department of Homeland Security was issuing warnings about right-wing violence as early as 2009, but it didn't really come into public view until 2015, 2016, 2017, and then people really started paying attention.
And there were real-world failures of American institutions during these times as well. I mean, the Iraq War, opioid crisis, the banking crisis of 2008, there was plenty to be angry about. Deindustrialization.
Absolutely. No, there were all sorts of things for people to be upset about. The Iraq War and the Afghanistan wars not only are seen as massive failures and betrayals by the federal government, but they again lead to more weapons of war coming into the country, the fear of the war on terror, the idea that people are constantly under attack or potentially under attack, the decline in standards of living, the expansion of debt. Like, there are all sorts of reasons why people would not only distrust the government, but would find themselves in more extreme circles. The rise of social media actually exacerbates this as well because it aids radicalization. So there are a lot of things feeding into this system, which is not to excuse the decision to join a militia or take up arms against the government, but it explains why more and more people do.
Well, as I mentioned at the top of our interview here, I always viewed these groups as, well, somewhat harmless. I mean, they certainly look scary, but they kept to themselves. But obviously not when we're talking about Ruby Ridge and Waco. There have been clashes with federal law enforcement authorities. And then, of course, January 6th. I mean, you were on my podcast some months ago talking about Pat Buchanan. I've done a number of episodes over the past year or so about the origins of our right-wing populism that dominates the Republican Party today. But I never really talked about militias in this context. Alex Jones, he also has a role to play here. Talking about, the lunatic fringe bleeding into the mainstream. Donald Trump went on Alex Jones's radio show a few years ago and praised him. But Jones has some link to Waco and all of this crazy stuff in the 90s.
This is where Jones builds his reputation. He forwards a number of Waco conspiracy theories. He creates a documentary, America, Wake Up or Waco. And he also raises money to rebuild the Branch Davidian's church on the site of where the Waco siege happened. And as he's doing that, he is spreading conspiracies about this being something that had been set up by the federal government in order to show patriots that they're no match for the federal government, spreading false flag conspiracies, which he spread about Oklahoma City at the time as well. And Jones really was seen as a fringe figure. After he has made his hay off of Waco, he will talk about the 9/11 attacks being false flags, but he comes into his own in the Trump era, 2015, 16, 17, when he is talking to the president of the United States and claims some responsibility for the president being elected. He hires Roger Stone to have a show on InfoWars. So yes, I mean, this is one of the places where you can see not just somebody like Jones being mainstreamed, but if you watch Tucker Carlson's Patriot Purge, which is the documentary that he made about the January 6th assault on the Capitol, it could have just as easily been made by Alex Jones, and you would never be able to tell the difference.
So there was
higher production values, maybe.
Yeah. In the end here, there was fertile ground for someone like Trump and his conspiracy theories.
One of the things that we see is that these far-right extremist groups understand the election of Donald Trump as a green light for their actions, right? They see in Donald Trump somebody who supports their ideas. And in moments where you see flare-ups of far-right violence or far-right militia groups coming out and marching and doing other things during the Trump years, there's not a lot of pushback from the White House. And again, it's seen again and again, like that statement for the Proud Boys to stand back and stand by. All of those things are seen as signals.
Are you willing tonight to condemn white supremacists and militia groups and to say that they need to stand down and not add to the violence in a number of these cities, as we saw in Kenosha and as we've seen in Portland?
Sure,
Are you
I'm
prepared
willing
to
do
specifically
that, but
do it? Well, go ahead, sir.
I would say almost everything I see is from the left wing, not from the right wing.
So what are you saying?
I'm willing to do anything. I want to see peace.
Then do it, sir.
Say it. Do it. Say it.
Do you want to call them? What do you want to call them? Give me a name. Give me a
white
name.
Supremacists and
who would
white
you like me to condemn?
White supremacists and right
Proud Boys. Stand back and stand by. But I'll tell you what. Somebody's got to do something about Antifa and the left, because this is not a right-wing problem.
From the president to these groups, that what they are doing is right and they should continue forward with their agendas. And the rally at Waco is doing the exact same thing.
And the white supremacist parade, or wherever that was, at Charlottesville a few summers ago, was there to defend, originally, right, the original parade or march, I'm not sure what to call it, was to defend the statue of Robert E. Lee.
That's right. That had been a target of these groups. Richard Spencer had been one of the organizers. The Proud Boys were a pretty significant group organizing there as well. But all of these far-right groups were gathering at Charlottesville, first of all, to defend this image of the Confederacy. They called it a free speech rally, but really it was a planned act of political violence, and one that, of course, ended in the death of Heather Heyer and a couple dozen people being injured as well.
I mentioned Buchanan before. He also flirted with these groups. He gave a campaign speech at a Confederate monument, right?
You got a new ad. You're talking about quotas. You're coming to Confederate monuments. Are you playing racial politics?
Oh, come on. This is a monument for the entire South. Lee and Jackson. This is a landmark in Georgia. Everybody visits this place. And it's a wonderful place to visit.
Yankees do too. What about this new ad?
And that's a beautiful monument.
At Stone Mountain, Georgia, the Confederate Mount Rushmore. It's a big rock in Georgia that has the images of 3 Confederate leaders. And he also hired Larry Pratt as one of his national campaign directors. Larry Pratt was the head of Gun Owners for America, which is a more far-right version of the NRA. And Pratt himself had deep connections with both militia groups and far-right white nationalists. Buchanan often talked about himself as the cleaned-up version of David Duke. And there are a number of David Duke supporters who will end up campaigning for Buchanan in 92 and 96. And I think that that's an important lineage to understand to make sense of his particular brand of conservatism.
But that brand was not dominant in the party. It was there, and the flirtation was serious. But today it does seem dominant, if we're to believe polls. If Donald Trump is the most influential Republican politician in the country, if he is the most likely winner of the Republican nomination, what does that tell you?
The flirtation and even embrace of white supremacist group and far-right groups has been part of Donald Trump's politics throughout his runs for president. That's going to continue. He's paid no real price for it within the Republican Party, not among Republican voters. And I think the fact that after the siege of the Capitol, that he is not only running for president again, but that he is leading very clearly in the polls against potential challengers, suggests there's no political price to be paid for this kind of stirring up of significant violence that happened under his first term, that happened at the end of his presidency, and that seems destined to accompany his attempt to run for president again in 2024.
And that does not mean that most Republicans approve of that violence. They just don't see it as a reason not to vote for him.
Yeah, it does not mean that Republican voters all support militias, all support political violence. But I think that it is something that the GOP is going to need to wrestle with. And they don't seem particularly eager to hold people accountable. Like Donald Trump's doing fine in the polls. Liz Cheney, who tried to hold him accountable, is no longer in politics. And I think that suggests that's where the Republican base is. And at some point, the party is going to have to come to terms with that.
Last question is, what's the end goal here, though? I mean, Trump is running for president as an enemy of the federal government. If you read what he said at the Waco rally, he doesn't sound like somebody who really wants to run the U.S. government. For folks who are on this fringe, or maybe it's larger than a fringe now, whether they're a sovereign citizen, a member of the Proud Boys, whoever. There are a lot of these groups. We'd spend all day going down the list of names. What is their end goal? Is it to create an anarchy, to dismantle the federal government? What is it?
I don't think it's about anarchy. I think that it is about consolidating control and power. They want to be able to say what happens in their own lives, and they want to make sure that the federal government and any other institution doesn't stop them from being top of the heap, whatever that looks like, whether that's a group like the Proud Boys that are sort of proudly masculinist in men's rights in their politics, whether it's these far-right white supremacist groups that see a racial hierarchy, or Christian identity groups that see a religious hierarchy. They're for hierarchies. They're not anarchists, but they want to stay in power, and they see this as a way of keeping that power.
Well, they don't want to pay taxes, but tough. We all have to pay taxes. But what are they being compelled to do? I mean, are they really being denied any rights? I mean, what are they trying to stop happening? Is it the diversification of American society that they're opposed to, or demographic forces?
That is a big part of it. I mean, they're very concerned that the government is going to take their guns. They're very concerned about what's being taught in schools. They're very concerned about having to pay taxes. If I don't want to do it, I shouldn't have to do it. And it's happening within an atmosphere where all of these ideas are fed by conspiracy. So even if it seems very irrational to think that the government is going to come take all your guns, or the government is going to make your child go through a sex change operation, they are in a media environment that tells them that those things are imminent, and they're fighting back against those fears.
Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt University, we thank you. According to a Morning Consult poll, a tracking poll, as of today, over half of potential Republican primary voters, 52%, would back Donald Trump if the primary or caucus were held in their state today, compared with 26% who would support Ron DeSantis. Make sure to sign up for my newsletter at historyasithappens.com. Every Friday morning, you'll get an email from the Washington Times. New podcast episodes every Tuesday and Thursday. My newsletter every Friday at historyasithappens.com or wherever you get your podcasts.